My name is Annemie Viaene from Baringa. I'm a partner in the Energy and Resources practice at Baringa. I'm happy to share with you the webinar that we held on June 23rd about enabling power market access for small-scale flexibility providers. On the agenda, we had first a small introduction, followed by 3 speakers. The first speaker was Mr. Richard Sarti from Nodes. He had the market operator view on the problem. Then we had Bruno Gouverneur. Bruno Gouverneur is Deputy Secretary General at Synergrid. He presented the DSO view from Belgium. And the last speaker was Ms. Jenna Boyle from Limejump, and she shared with us the aggregator view about flexibility. At the end, we had a little debate and questions and answer session with Nicola Plower and Duncan Sinclair, who are both belonging to Baringa. Duncan Sinclair is our network specialist and partner. Nicola Plower is our specialist in trading and flexibility solutions. Maybe a little introduction about Baringa. So Baringa has an energy and resources practice. Overall, we are a 700 people business. We are a great place to work and are global. So we are present in London, Brussels, Düsseldorf, Abu Dhabi, Singapore, Sydney, New York. And what are we known for? First of all, our deep energy market knowledge and insight. We produce energy market and climate change scenarios. And these are also described in our market reports, which are bought by numerous parties in the market. Banks, investors, people who actually have an asset in the energy market and want to optimize that asset and have a forecast on where revenues could go. So we help actually strategic investors to make their choices, to navigate the markets and to create value from their assets. We optimize also operations and operating models, look into efficiency, digitalization. When you look at our profiles, we are pretty senior experts, and we like to be flexible, innovative, efficient, and partner together with our clients. So we have a motto called Brighter Together. As we are navigating the transition, we need to co-create solutions as we go. So now, hitting the topic, we all know that the energy transition has started. We come from the old world where we had central generation, large scale, central reserve mechanisms, large players, and we move into a new world where we have decentral generation with high intermittency of smaller scale, EV, so electrical vehicles, so a much more decentral world with also decentral problems. And the flexibility is one of them. When we overall look at what we try to do in the system, in the power network, first of all, we need security of supply. Secondly, I think it's important that we manage congestion. So, and as we move into the new decentral world, congestion may appear more on the local level. And that means we also need to find solutions, and flexibility is one of these solutions. We also have the aim of avoiding stranded assets, and we want to avoid imbalance. And overall, we try to make sure the global system cost is as low as possible. On the bottom of this graph, what I like to show is actually that flexibility is depending on the phase the grid and the power network is in. First of all, we may have a phase where there's no noticeable impact of variable or intermittent renewable energy resources. Then we move into a second phase in the system where we may have minor or moderate impact of intermittent resources. We can move into a third phase where the intermittency is actually starting to determine the system operation pattern. So we need to start actively doing things. In a phase 4, we may have intermittent renewables covering almost all of the generation in parts of the day. And then we can move into phases 5 and 6, where we actually have surpluses of renewable energy, be it on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, or even in an interseasonal basis. On this next slide, I have a graph from the IEA. In this graph, you see a number of countries with their percentages of actual annual electricity generation from renewables and intermittent renewables. And you also see the colors in the bars, and the colors represent actually the phases these countries are in, as I just referred to in the previous slide. As you see on the right side, typically we find countries like Denmark, South Australia, Ireland, United Kingdom. These countries have already pretty high percentages of penetration of renewable energy, and they are already in phase 4. So that means that in quite some periods, the renewable energy makes up for the largest chunk of generation. So these are the countries that are already dealing and needing to deal with flexibility in a much more advanced way than the countries that would be in a phase 1, like the blue or the green ones in the system here, where actually the relevance of flexibility in the system or decentral flexibility in the system is still lower. What we can see definitely is that Europe is leading the game. So there are quite some countries, European countries on the right side of the graph. There are definitely also other countries like, or at least certain regions of certain countries that are also part of this game. So you, as I said, so you find South Australia there, but also some regions in China have already reached phase 3. So you see that already pretty many countries have to deal with flexibility as a solution, or have to deal with intermittency and find solutions. So when we come into the topic of flexibility, there are different aspects we need to look at. First of all, we need to see where can flexibility come from. So if we need to find flexibility resources, where are they? Well, first of all, we can find them in the conventional bigger units that are on the TSO level, on the central level, but we also can find decentral flexible renewable units. We could also find better controlled, and having a greater control over renewable assets is definitely also a source of flexibility. Actually, quite some of the older generation renewable assets are not controllable, and so therefore they cannot participate in the flexibility schemes. So making them controllable, and at least for the new generation of renewable assets, it's important to making them controllable. There's definitely also the demand side flexibility. So demand side management is a big chunk of the flexibility that we can go after. We can also find new or improved ancillary services. We may find grid interconnection, so through interconnections with other countries, and so also on the grid side we can find some flexibility. We can look for market design improvements. We could also look at better coordination across voltage levels with different players, so between TSOs and DSOs. We could also have smart grid infrastructure, and bidirectional communication is definitely an enabler of flexibility. We need signals to be communicated to assets that have to shut off or shut on. Then we have definitely storage systems that we can integrate, so batteries. And actually what we also, in a very advanced way, could look at is the sectoral integration, so where we could have power to gas solutions. We could also look at hydrogen solutions. So definitely there is a bunch of flexibility resources that we have to activate. Today we are actually looking at the small scale flexibility, but there are definitely, as I said, many sources to look at. In the left bottom corner, what you see is that flexibility has actually also a characteristic, or a number of characteristics. First of all, it's about scale, location, and voltage level. So at what voltage level do we want flexibility? What is the location in the grid that we need flexibility, and where we need flexibility, and what is the scale? So how much of flexibility do we need? Is it central? Is it decentral? Small or large? Is it TSO level or DSO level? Those are all types of questions we need to ask ourselves when we discuss flexibility. Then there is also a time frame. You may have flexibility that responds to real-time problems. We may also have short-term or mid-term or long-term problems to solve with flexibility solutions. So definitely we need to discuss the time frame that we try to address when we look into flexibility solutions. Because power systems might have a very adequate solution for the long term, but not for the short term, or vice versa. The third important element of flexibility is that it has a function and there is a buyer for it. Typically, the functions that flexibility could provide in the system are offering system stability, where the buyer would be DSOs or TSOs. We could also have congestion alleviation and try to avoid curtailment. That also would be the buyer for that flexibility would be DSOs or TSOs. And overall, there is also an aim to have imbalance solved, and definitely the balance responsible parties would be the buyers for this. So the market players would be the buyers for this. So as you already see, there are different players out there after the flexibility. And that also leads to a trade-off discussion, like if there is a limited number of flexibility in the system, would it then be the DSO or DSO priority to receive this flexibility or to buy this flexibility versus the market players or the balance responsible parties? So that's an interesting debate. On the cost side, definitely we need to acknowledge that flexibility has a cost, and different sources of flexibility may have different costs and offer and bring extra charges into the system, which overall we try to minimize. And then you have proximity. So how far is actually the source of flexibility situated from the user of that flexibility? Because if we are very close together, we don't overload the system, whereas if the source and the sink of flexibility are far apart, we may have to use quite some capacity in the grid. And so there's a discussion always to be held on where should we organize our flexibility compared to the source of the of the imbalance or the problem. Then there is the enablers of flexibility. On the right-hand side on the top, you see definitely an important enabler, which is the smart metering for small-scale flexibility. In this graph, as you will see, the dark blue countries are the countries where the smart metering rollout is finished or nearly finished. In the skin-colored countries like France, UK, you see the tail of the rollout program right now. So this is almost done. What you then see are the red countries like Germany, Poland, etc., who have delayed their rollout programs, and then you have countries like Belgium who really have delayed their rollout even further. And that was definitely due to a business case that was not so positive. But that, of course, now shows that we bump into some problems when we talk about flexibility, because in some countries, the flexibility is facilitated by smart metering, whilst in others, the technology is not yet in place or not yet fully in place. On the bottom right corner in the graph or in the slide here, what you also see is that flexibility needs a number of elements to be in place and to be clarified before we actually can use it. First, there are the system prerequisites. We need someone looking into planning of the system, short-term, mid-term, long-term. When and where are we going to have problems, and what is then the flexibility solution that we put in place to address these problems? There is definitely a regulation and market design or redesign element to it. So the market's mechanisms have to be redesigned, products may have to be redesigned, tariffs and incentives. And there's also, as I already said, a prioritization to be done. If there's scarce flexibility, who is then getting the first right to use it? On the infrastructure side, there's a definite discussion and debate ongoing about signals, market price signals that could steer in an automated way the market for flexibility. And definitely these signals are not yet in place, or in many places not yet there. We also need measurement of the inflexibility or of the imbalance, and also then controls to activate the flexibility. We need forecasting systems, we need settlement systems. So the settlement system typically is invoicing and paying the respective parties that have been using and offering the flexibility into the market. So this is the system prerequisite, or the context we need to have flexibility operating. Then you need a process, which is actually a daily process that we need to manage, which is the forecasting on a daily basis, how much flexibility we will need. So when the need is identified, we then also need to find the solution for it. So then we enter into bidding processes or bid allocation processes. And then you may have automated or manual activation or disactivation of flexibility. And as said, there is a daily post-delivery settlement process that needs to be handled to actually make sure the money flows from the one offering the flexibility to the one using the flexibility. Then we have players in the market, as I said, and the players that we used to know, like TSOs, DSOs, aggregators, may have to change roles or may have to adapt their roles in the market as the system is evolving. So what we are now going to hear is the voice of different of those players. We will have a DSO view, we will have an aggregator view, and a market platform operator view on flexibility. So I'm happy to introduce to you now the first speaker, who is Richard Sarti from Nodes, and he will explain a bit of his experience and the experience of Nodes in trying to set up flexibility market in different places in Europe.
So we've been asked, why is there a lack of small-scale flexibility in the market today? And I think the consequence of there being a lack of small-scale flexibility can be seen probably as directly as a result of what's been happening with COVID-19. During the lockdown period, there's been several studies on the impact that this has had on our energy system and our environment. And a recent study has shown that consumption levels during the early period of lockdown were down by 14%. Renewables, particularly solar generation, had increased in their utilization towards the contribution of energy within the overall energy mix. And we've seen increasing erratic consumption patterns emerging, particularly as people are in the lockdown period. We've got people choosing through technology when and how they should be using their energy. And as a result, this has created some significant issues for grid operators. So with demand being so low, they've had to install emergency measures to curtail large-scale generation or increasing the amount of redispatch that needs to take place. And this is sort of underpinned further by the fact that we've seen extended periods of negative prices in the market, all of which highlights the lack of flexibility that exists today. And I think somebody described it as a postcard from the future. And ultimately, this is kind of what we will expect to see in the future as people take more control over when and how they consume energy, how decentralized the system becomes. Renewables will be connected to the distribution network. Large-scale generation will no longer be party to the overall energy mix, or it'll diminish quite significantly, meaning that the congestion levels will be managed at a local level rather than at a national level. And this overall means that we have to also think about the market design generally. And that traditional approach of a top-down arrangement perhaps needs to be reversed, and we start looking at a bottom-up market design where DSOs are responsible for managing constraints in their own network, isolating the issues, and understanding what they need to do, whether it's a increasing amount of investment to reinforce the network, or providing the right price signals to allow flexibility to help stabilize the network in that area. And then this takes away a lot of the responsibility and the challenges that the TSO has about balancing the grid nationally. So I think that this contributes to why there is a lack of small-scale flexibility in the market. The overall market design doesn't support flexibility at scale, at least today. There are significant lack of price signals or market signals to incentivize the use or building of new scale of flexibility. And at the moment, I see it that the flexibility historically has been put in place to manage a national issue. And actually, we need to be thinking more strategically about where flexibility needs to be located in order to provide the right level of flexibility at the right time, in the right place, at the right price. So this means that the way that DNOs have been operating in the past, where they've been looking at long-term flexibility as a hedge towards how they would foresee the challenges that they're facing around the future requirements of the network, also needs to change. And underpinning all of that is the overall regulatory framework and how that will support the engagement of flexibility beyond what exists today. Within nodes, we've been involved in several projects in and around Europe, one of which is in northern Norway, where we've been assisting with the growth of the fishing industry, where large-scale industrial freezer units have been installed, increasing the amount of demand on the medium-term grid, or the medium-level grid in those areas. And so by working with local businesses and the transmission system operator in that area, we've put in place a market-based solution, which is basically providing price signals as to when people can consume energy, or when not to consume energy. And more recently, we've actually been through the market, we've actually compensated, or allowed people to be compensated for non-utilization of energy. So they've scaled back their consumption patterns and requirements, and have been paid as a result of that. And this gives a clear understanding about the level of engagement, or the price mechanisms that could be utilized in order to determine what operates and what doesn't. This provides incentives for flexibility providers. It develops additional revenue streams, and also provides price signals as where future generation or future flexibility can be offered as part of that. And then in addition to that, we've been also involved in a project in Germany, where a local grid operator has been paying a local generator to curtail its generation capability. Basically, there's a large wind farm in an area of low consumption levels. And so by engaging with a local industrial plant, we've been able to create price signals as to when the industrial units can scale back their productivity using some of the assets that they've got, flexible assets that they've got on site. And as a result, we've seen that the grid operator has been able to reduce its overall cost of operation, because the amount of payments that it's making with regards to compensating the industrial plant for not producing, compared to paying the generator to curtail, is significantly less. And in addition to that, by managing this effectively, we've also been able to reduce the CO2 emissions in that area, saving around 240 tons of CO2. So this gives a clear understanding that, or I say this gives an understanding about how flexibility markets could be utilized to provide revenue streams, or additional revenue streams, for industry and domestic households, as we look to become more dynamic in how we manage the grid stability. So I think that, as DNOs transition towards DSOs, a greater understanding of the roles and responsibilities that sit within that will help reduce the barriers of greater participation. In addition to that, creating a level playing field between the different types of flexibility assets, being generation, demand side response, and storage, and also looking at the current tariff structure as well. And a recent study by the European Energy, or the Committee for European Energy Regulators, put out a paper about the different types of tariff structures that could be implemented to better support flexibility that beyond what exists today, although it's commonly understood that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we have to look at local markets in order to understand how these tariff structures should be amended in order to support the flexibility in those areas. And then I think that, looking at in summary, how do we reduce these barriers, or how do we overcome these barriers? I think that, when we've looked at the projects that Nodes has got involved in, it is very much a collaborative approach. It is a commitment from the DSO to test flexibility before grid reinforcement, working with local industry, working with technology providers such as ourselves, to create a market structure that allows for flexibility to be tested ahead of that grid reinforcement. And in our opinion, this sort of goes to underpin one of the core principles within the clean energy package, which is looking for flexibility to be tested ahead of reinforcement, ultimately reducing the overall cost of grid operations and creating greater efficiency, which ultimately benefits the consumer. This is particularly important as DSOs take on board more social responsibility in the future. But in order to do that, I think that there needs to be increased innovation stimulus to provide the DSOs with the funding needed to try this out. And I think when we look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on our economy, and the fact that we've been given this vision of the future about how green our society could be based on being more dynamic in how we manage our energy consumption, then we're seeing a lot of the economic recovery being framed around a more sustainable future. And so more on the back of that, more funding towards the DSOs would be significantly appreciated, I'm sure. And then also looking at how how we view CapEx and OpEx, and actually looking at perhaps a more total expenditure rather than differentiating between capital expenditure and operational expenditure, which are treated differently today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think we can transition to the next topic, which is definitely the DSO side of things. So I would like to progress to introduce Bruno Gouverneur, who is the representative of Synergrid. And I look forward to hear his viewpoint from the Belgian DSO side.
So as you can see on the timeline there on the slide, we decided in Belgium, so DSOs, TSO and regulators together, to enable small-scale flexibility access to the power markets in a progressive and phased approach. It started already in 2014 with the tertiary reserves markets, and in a few months from now, in September, the entire ancillary balancing services market will be open to small-scale flexibility, so R1, R2 and R3. However, this access to this market is currently limited essentially to customers connected to the medium voltage distribution grid for a simple reason that you already highlighted, Annemie, is that in Belgium we are very late in terms of rollout of smart meters. Then, as from the beginning of next year, it will be possible to sell energy on the wholesale markets, both on the day-ahead and the intraday, in the form of flexibility. And next year as well, it will also become possible to participate to the first auction of the capacity remuneration mechanism with flexible resources connected to the distribution grid, at least if the CRM design proposed by Belgium is accepted by the European Commission. The next step will normally be the use of commercial small-scale flexibility for congestion management purposes, so dispatch and redispatch for the needs of the transmission network. Normally, as from 2023, it may seem very late, also from what I heard today compared to other countries where congestion management seemed to be a higher priority. But the main reason in Belgium is simply that there is, as we speak, at least only very limited congestion issues on the Belgian network. Now, in terms of statistics, numbers, the figures that you see below on the slide, they are not bad, I think, since we have today 15 flexibility providers active on the Belgian distribution grid, and they manage in total a portfolio of close to 700 megawatt of small-scale flexibility, which is at the end quite significant if you compare that to the total size of the ancillary services market in Belgium, which is approximately 1 gigawatt. But the number of distribution grid users which are effectively participating is still quite limited, a bit lower than 300, which means that it's mainly large SMEs that currently offer their flexibility on the market. It's also finally important to note, and this is visible right under the timeline, that the TSO and the DSOs in Belgium, they have developed since 2018 joint data management systems in order to cope efficiently with the increasing amount of data related to the growing small-scale flexibility. And we believe that this kind of collaboration can only pay off for the transition to more flexibility on the market. Next slide, please. So what did we learn so far? Well, there are a few points mentioned on the slide, but I would like to highlight 3 of them. First, if the authorities, if the regulators want to really boost the direct participation of small-scale flex to the power markets, they have to design the market in such a way that, first of all, independent flex providers have clear roles and clear responsibilities, but also that there are very robust and fair rules in place in terms of confidentiality of information, in terms of transfer of energy between the market players, to make sure that their business and the business of the suppliers, of the retailers, can effectively develop separately from each other. Secondly, we also believe that, as I mentioned already, that the TSO and the DSOs have an important role to play as neutral flexibility data managers between all the commercial actors, and a close collaboration between the system operators is necessary to play this role efficiently and to help in the transition to a more flexibility-based market. And then third point, we should not forget that there are other ways for a customer, especially for an industrial one or SME, to optimize its energy bill by using its own flexibility for himself. For example, in order to smooth its peak, power peak. So convincing these industrial customers, these SMEs, to offer the flexibility on the power market, which is perceived, I think, by many as an additional complexity, is a real challenge, I think, for the market actors. Low voltage. As explained before, in Belgium, we have put a lot of efforts so far to enable the market access for small-scale flexibility, mainly from the customers connected to the medium voltage grid. What about low voltage customers, which obviously represent a very significant potential of small-scale flexibility, of very small-scale flexibility, especially now with the growth or expected growth of electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on. Well, to be honest, we are not yet ready for it in Belgium, as I already said, first of all, because our country is very late in terms of smart metering. We have started the rollout, especially in the north of the country, but it will still take a few years before a significant percentage of low voltage customers are equipped with smart meters. Nevertheless, we have launched the DSOs and sometimes also together with the TSO area, they have launched some pilot projects to test ideas, to test new market services using flexibility from the low voltage grid users. You may have heard of Internet of Energy Innovation Project, but there are many others which are currently running at different levels with different concepts being tested on the DSO grids. What is common between all these projects is that they are really customer-centric. They have a focus on the customer itself. All these projects are still running, but what we perceive already, even though it's too early to draw decisive conclusions, but what we perceive already is that it's quite tricky, it's quite challenging for for new market actors to design business propositions which are attractive for the small customers, for the low voltage grid users, and still profitable for the flexibility providers. What we also perceive, as I said, is that there needs to be a different design between the market, the business proposition for medium voltage customers and for low voltage customers, in terms of service design, in terms of privacy, of course, in terms of data platform, etc. So to name a few differences which probably will make the market design between flexibility on the low voltage grid and flexibility on the medium voltage grid will, I would say, look differently. And then last but not least, I'd like to highlight an important aspect for the DSO, which is true at all voltage levels, but particularly sensitive on the low voltage grid. It's that flexibility is both an opportunity and a risk or a threat in terms of congestion. It's of course a way, so that's the opportunity side. It's a way to lift local congestion issues which can arise from concentrated renewable sources, for example. But it's also a potential source of congestion by itself. When many flexible loads like EVs connected in the same street or in the same district are activated simultaneously. So this is a major challenge for the market, for the DSOs especially, to enable market access for this very small scale flexibility without too many restrictions while keeping a safe network. So we'll have to find the right balance in the future between the various interests in that respect. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Very interesting. So I think it's an element that, yeah, for me, it kind of rings a bell. It's about, so it's market design differentiation between voltage levels. I think that's something we may not have perceived as such so important. And I think a second one is the offerings of the products of the services and how you make them customer oriented to actually convince the clients or the potential participants in the flexibility market also at low voltage level. So very interesting observation. Thank you. So, and with that, I suggest we transition to Limejump, to Jenna Boyle, who is going to give us a viewpoint from the aggregator side. So maybe she can help us out on the customer centricity of this offering.
Cool, thank you, Annemie. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Jenna. I'm from Limejump, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Shell New Energies. My role at Limejump is Head of Business Development, and previously to that, I've been heavily involved in trading, both in the UK and New Zealand. So with a real focus on commercialising renewable energy assets and flexibility. So Limejump is a energy tech startup. We've been around since 2014 in the UK. And our real core focus is moving towards a renewable energy future and enabling market access for both renewable energy generators and flexibility providers, because I think with both Annemie, Richard and Bruno's comments, there's no way realistically of getting to a renewable energy future without leveraging flexibility as much as possible. So Limejump's been a real leader in the UK battery market in particular. In 2018, we entered the UK balancing mechanism, which is, for those who aren't familiar with it, a real-time market where flexibility providers, and historically that's been dominated by larger transmission connected assets, can offer volume and prices into the national grid and be dispatched in real time. We also really led the way with getting batteries into the frequency response markets in the UK, which is definitely a real growth area to keep supply and demand matched in real time. We also have a shift trading team that is optimizing our flexible and renewable assets across a number of different market time horizons, essentially looking to commercialize them as much as possible, because I think all of us would agree on this call that the market signal needs to be there to commercialize these assets. So looking at this context in the UK, we've got the UK National Grid came out and said that they want to run a carbon neutral system by 2025, which is a strong ambition and one which we absolutely support at Limejump. And as you can see, we're well on the way to becoming more and more renewable. Like taking 2020 to date, we've already broken our maximum wind, maximum solar, minimum carbon intensity, and the longest coal-free generation record in the UK. So it's a real time of change, irrespective of COVID-19, which I'll come on to in a moment. We are seeing things move at the moment, which is really a positive news story for flexibility, but also creates a real challenge, right, for National Grid in particular to ensure security of supply. With an increasing volume of intermittent renewables and an increasing volume of renewables that are on the distribution network rather than purely on the transmission network. That's creating a challenge for them, but one which Limejump is ready and already actively trying to manage for our customers and providing that flexibility to grid. So for us, how we look at flexibility across a number of different time horizons. So I touched on batteries before. For us, the real value of a battery is being able to respond to sudden changes in supply and demand imbalance. So that has historically in the UK been frequency response, but increasingly so is responding to supply and demand imbalance through the likes of the balancing mechanism or through the tradable market to essentially leverage that volatility and respond to it. So, for instance, in the UK, something we've seen in the past few months with every Thursday we have a clap for carers for the NHS, and we've seen about at 8 p.m. and at about 8:05 we've seen, as everybody else comes back into their house and turns the oven back on, we've seen an increase in demand of about 3 to 5% in the UK, which is pretty sizable. That's about the size of a large CCGT. Now, responding to changes in demand like that aren't necessarily forecast is, a great market for batteries, and where, frequency response and having batteries able to respond to really near-term price signals is important and absolutely core to managing an increasingly renewable system. So that's, I think, one of the core growth areas we do see. Another one that I do want to touch on in light of COVID-19 is the flexible renewables. So I think Limejump were really encouraged by, with the extreme reduction we saw in demand as a result of COVID-19, and particularly when that coincided with very, very high renewable generation. For instance, over the late May bank holiday weekend, National Grid essentially introduced a new product called optional downward flexibility management. Now, that was something we engaged with them on quite significantly, and that I think is a really encouraging sign for renewables. So this was essentially enabling grid to access embedded renewable generation that they historically haven't been able to access. So being able to turn off wind or solar. At this point, it was at the day ahead stage for various time horizons. Now, that is really critical that renewables are able to be flexible or supported by flexible assets to enable their continued growth. Because I think at this point in time for Maybank Holiday, to Annemie's phases early on, the UK was definitely a borderline phase 5 or 6, where we had a surplus of renewable generation, which obviously was causing real security of supply issues for the national grid, and really encouraging that the market and industry was able to come together with a new product to help support that. So I think that's definitely a really cool market signal and a sign to the future, and something we're really following closely at Limejump. And also that has to be in the also looking at the gas peaker and fast responding asset space as well. We've got such extreme changes in renewable generation as wind, for instance, ramps up or solar comes up or down. And that's really difficult to manage and absolutely supported by flexible assets such as gas peakers. And finally, one of the things I want to touch on, and a real challenge that I see for National Grid, is a challenge of inertia. So at the moment, inertia, which is essentially big spinning mass, is provided predominantly by the UK's CCGT and coal generation fleets. Now, if we want to be a carbon neutral grid before 2025, that's going to be a real challenge for grid to commercialise inertia and also create the market signals for renewable generators, for instance, to look at inverters to provide synthetic inertia or otherwise. Because at the moment, what they do have to do is, if you take the Maybank Holiday as an example, they turned off a lot of embedded renewables, but still had to run some CCGTs to provide inertia, as well as giving them flexibility in both headroom and footroom. So I think that's a real challenge for the industry, is how do we become renewable through flexibility, not just in the seconds and minutes stage with batteries and gas peakers, but also the flexibility of renewable assets and other products of the energy system, including inertia. So yeah, that is, I'd say, that the main summary from our side. Limejump, we are really trying to drive forward the commercialization of flexible assets through optimizing them across different markets, and really looking to push the boundaries to get UK to be carbon neutral and rewarding our flexible assets as they should be as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Very interesting. I think this highlighted indeed the importance of looking at, let's say, the time horizon, what the flexibility is supposed to serve. So I think that leaves us kind of 15 minutes for questions and answers. So I have on the screen, let's say, the pictures of the people that you have been hearing. I think you haven't heard Duncan, Sinclair, and you haven't heard Nicola yet. So they may come online right now as part of our question and answer session. So Nicola, you were going to be the one guiding us through that, right?
I am indeed, Annemie. Yes, thank you to our speakers. Really interesting kind of perspectives. We've got a number of questions that have come through the chat, so maybe I'll put some to Richard first. So, Richard, a question that came through to you was, what proposition of small-scale flexibility do you think will be enabled by tariff reform versus the need to be procured by the DSO in the future?
Oh, that's a great question. One that I'm not sure I can answer right off the bat, to be honest. I think I mean, from our side, we're still exploring, you know, the type of flexibility that could be accessed. I think that it's going to be interesting to see how tariff reform is able to affect or incentivize the way we procure long-term flexibility, but also short-term flexibility, and providing the right signals for those assets that are perhaps temperature sensitive to be available in the market. So it's difficult to put a number on it, but I would probably like to take that question away and think about it in a bit more detail, perhaps.
No problem at all. To Bruno, are DSOs in Belgium looking at supporting energy efficiency measures as a form of flexibility service to reduce peak load?
I don't think we looked at energy efficiency from the flexible side of it so far. We in one of the pilot projects that I know of, we are using data to sensibilize customers about their consumption and about their peak loads. So to try to indeed sensitize them to reduce their peak load. This is one of the projects which is running, but we haven't really developed energy efficiency measures as a form of flexibility service so far. It's a good idea, by the way.
Another question for you then, Bruno, if I may, on a similar topic. I think you mentioned in the last slide around kind of EVs and the potential risk that poses. Mm-hmm. One of the participants was maybe suggesting that also brings the need for even further increased low voltage flexibility. So I suppose it's just to understand, where does the balance between the risk and the opportunity lie in your perspective?
So indeed, that's a tricky one. EVs as such, if they really become mainstream, if a large proportion of people are driving electric vehicles in the future, I mean, they could cause congestion issues on the network, especially on the low voltage network, because there will be a kind of natural simultaneity of the charging of these electric vehicles. So there are several ways to cope with that. One of them is trying to work with I would say market tools like tariffs, price differentiation, etc. Another way is to have a more direct I would say more direct influence on the charging profile by using smart chargers and trying to piloting directly or indirectly smart chargers. But what I meant in the last slide is that as electric vehicles are going to be a source of flexibility, an important source of flexibility from low voltage grids, even if we are not late in the evening when it's the natural peak and when we fear that there could be a natural congestion due to the additional charge coming from the electric vehicles, even at other moments of the day, there could be some activations by third parties of the batteries inside the electric vehicles, which could all of a sudden in the middle of the afternoon, when the prices are low, for example, cause a congestion peak on the network. So that's why EVs could be a risk, but it's true that it's also an opportunity, because in the same afternoon, if you have too much solar production, PV production, in a district with very large proportion of solar installations, then EVs could be a part of the solution. I mean, to balance locally the production and the consumption. So it's really a balance that we will have to find, and probably different kinds of solutions that will have to be put in place to cope with these different situations.
I imagine we could probably have an entire hour just dedicated to that question alone.
Probably.
Just to add on that, it's Duncan Sinclair here, and I think that's a really interesting point that obviously DNOs or DSOs are used to random consumption amongst their customers and a lot of diversification for their planning standards. But if the demand side does become more engaged and more sensitized to price, which obviously has huge benefits, there is obviously the risk that everyone starts chasing the same price signals, particularly if there's automation as well. And so that's a behavior that we are yet to see in any great kind of volume, but it's really quite interesting that the paradigms in which sort of systems are planned might change as consumers get much more responsive to price signals.
Yeah, I think this is indeed something to really deep dive a bit into. I think this the parallel management of the energy incentives and the flex incentives, making sure they are not contradicting each other, both on the grid side and tariff side, on the grid tariff side, but also on the let's say the consumption side of it. So I think that's an important topic that we may further deep dive into a little bit later maybe.
Another question that's come through for Richard, hopefully not as to put you on the spot as the last one, but it's related to that point around price signals. So is there a case, the question is there a case to use dynamic price signals, not contracted flex initially, to build small scale flex asset base and then move towards markets once they've developed the market and have enough critical mass? Just kind of your thoughts, particularly in relation to the EV debate or discussion we just had.
Yeah. So I think the way that our market design is being applied is to try and create price signals across the different levels of the grid. By doing so, we are taking a grid zone and turning that into an order book for people to, or for the DSO predominantly, to identify within their network where the areas of constraint are and at what level of the grid. And then allowing those market participants who've got flexibility assets that are able to provide support into those different levels of the grid to activate. And I think what we're trying to do in that respect is to balance the situation where you've got through the long-term flex, you've got the creation of or reservation pricing for securing that access to that asset, and then creating a competitive market within the activation price area. So trying to drive that price signal in the short flex areas is what's going to identify what type of asset should run when and where that asset should be placed. Now, at the moment, my understanding is that we're not building assets to be based on locational pricing at this point, and I think that's ultimately where we want to get to, is to be able to provide the right price signals so that people can build their assets in the areas that are offering the right incentives. But during the initial stage of this development, it's really going to be reliant on the DSO or the DNO providing those price signals as we look to establish a more market-based solution. So, and this is the challenge of an early stage market development, is identifying how we create those price signals. So ultimately, the DSO will be the single buyer in this instance, but the competition will exist on the sell side, where the flexibility asset owners are competing to offer their asset into the market. And it's at that point, when that competition starts to arrive, that's when the price signals start to mature and we start to get people identifying where they should be locating those assets.
Maybe to bring Jenna into the discussion and kind of take one of the questions and kind of augment it a little bit, which is, Jenna, at the moment, from what I understand, Limejump are very much aggregating, so it's kind of small renewable assets, INC, kind of behind the meter, etc. So how do you think, in terms of how easy do you think it would be to take the model that you've got today and move it towards aggregating more SME and kind of domestic, smaller scale flex to provide some of the system services that currently you and Limejump are kind of hoping to kind of influence and drive with National Grid further?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to speak on that. So at the moment, we are at Limejump predominantly focused still on, I'd say, grid scale batteries, and peak is sort of over a megawatt in size. We do have assets, down to sort of 100 kilowatts, including solar and wind and smaller scale batteries. The real challenge with, and something that we're looking to tackle, is to bring that into a smaller market segment. It's and they essentially being able to do that in a cost-effective way, because there's obviously a number of costs associated with controlling these assets and having a way to control them remotely. And also, National Grid and all of those markets really trade in megawatt integers. So it's a question of sort of both market signal in terms of pricing and getting the critical mass to have sufficient volume to offer into the grid and control that in a way that makes it make sense. But that absolutely has to be the future. And one of the parts of the future anyway is to leverage that flexibility to enable us to progress on the renewable journey.
Just to follow up on that question just briefly, Jenna, do you think that there has to be sort of control functionality, or could it be in-home automation reacting to very granular kind of price signals, so more of a push than a sort of pull?
Yeah, it can be. So something interesting, actually. So I'm from New Zealand. One of the things that happens in that market is a real-time pricing mechanism, and there are sort of home and residential tariffs that are based on that real-time half-hour price, which tries to provide that push signal. I think the question is, and the challenge for the industry is to engage consumers to an extent in which they are prepared to respond to a push signal and price signal, or to automate that in the first place, that process for them, right, to make that valuable and to drive consumer engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. So, Nicola, we have, I think, one minute left.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll have to wrap up gently here.
Yes, it's again, I think we could have gone on for quite a lot longer, but thank you to all the participants for the presentations of really different kind of points of view, and also for the questions from the audience. As I said, really, really good ones coming through. I think in terms of just reflecting a few key points, very much, innovation seems to have been one of the themes that have come through. So it's not just about kind of market design. It's not just about the generation. It's kind of the innovation in terms of how we kind of go about and procure and facilitate the flexibility and access to market probably remains quite critical, not only in kind of terms of maturing the market, but also we've had that kind of insight from the COVID-19 market-based solutions will provide that, but not alone. In terms of Bruno, you echoed that through your market design question, and very much needing that balance between the medium voltage and low voltage propositions and how we encourage that participation. I think we just touched on that a little bit around kind of what does it look like from a supplier point of view and how that would encourage customers to participate. And from Jenna's side, very much it's kind of trying to make renewables more flexible. It needs to be that harmonization of the renewables with the flexible assets, which are going to deliver the biggest bang for its buck, hopefully in the shortest term. So really, really good set of debates, really, really good set of questions and comments from our panelists. So just want to say a big thank you to Richard, Bruno and Jenna, and to Annemie, to you for facilitating and introducing this session. So thank you to everybody for participating. We hope to see you at another session soon.
It's really interesting to hear the different perspectives of our speakers at our recent webinar on enabling small-scale flexibility. definitely different perspectives in terms of what needs to be done, and there's certainly challenges, but the common theme was very much that momentum is building, and certainly that flexibility from the demand side is really needed, not just to make sure that we can meet peak demand going forward, but also recent experience of COVID and very low demand periods have shown that we have excess generation at times, and we need, again, flexibility from the demand side to soak some of that up. At the same time, the potential is huge. There's existing flexibility that we can see already, but of course, with the expected rollout of electric vehicles and potentially electric heating, the potential is very substantial. And I think going forward, the view of the speakers is very much that if we need to have a more flexible electricity system to accommodate very, very high levels of renewables, then we will really need to see that flexibility from the demand side, particularly residential. The question then is, how is that enabled? Is that through more granular and dynamic price signals, or do system operators have to somehow procure directly that flexibility from those customers? On the price signal front, obviously, there's quite a lot of progress going on. The rollout of smart metering across Europe and internationally, increasing granularity in settlement, half-value settlement, or even smaller time granularity. And we are seeing tariff reform as well in terms of network charging, which is all making a big difference. The kind of key question is how will customers engage in that, and will they respond to those price signals? And we've been working with clients, for example, UK Power Networks here in the UK, looking at designing different approaches for network pricing for electric vehicle owners to see how they respond to those price signals. Also, we're working with organisations like Optimus Energy, analysing some of their initial smart tariff results with their electric vehicle customers. It's early days, but certainly the results are very encouraging. Coming back to the explicit procurement, I think the kind of received wisdom is that because residential customers are obviously very small, it's very difficult for them to access those markets. But again, we're seeing progress in this area. Recent results from flexibility tenders organised by UK Power Networks, for example, have shown that some successful bidders have been aggregators of small-scale flexibility, both into batteries and electric vehicle owners. So things are definitely moving. Interesting, this plays into kind of the wider distribution system operator debates that we're seeing. So what is the role for the distribution utility in accessing that flexibility and using it? And we've been working here in the UK, the Energy Networks Association, on their Open Networks project, looking at different potential models for how a DSO may evolve and how it interacts with National Grid as the DSO. But we've been doing similar work in Australia with the Energy Networks Australia and AMO down in Australia. Again, similar question, and likewise with the joint utilities of New York in the US as well. Really fascinating to see to which we see the central ISO or market operator taking that DSO role, so a whole system role, or will we be looking at models whereby the distribution system operators interact with the ISO to kind of coordinate the planning and the operations of more complex energy systems in the future. Still somewhere to go, but certainly some insights are beginning to develop. Again, the common kind of question amongst all of those projects is, what will the local flexibility markets look like? Who will they be run by? Who will interact with them? How will customers engage? And certainly the sort of transformations that we're seeing in technology and sort of access to data are really kind of opening up potential for how this could look. So it's exciting times. As I said, the need is definitely there to engage the demand side. Technology is coming forward and the changes are happening. So we're on a good path. I think the question now is to make sure that the market designs and the regulations in these markets can keep up, such that we can unlock that potential and ensure that we can deliver a lower cost way of delivering flexibility, and ensure that the decarbonisation and the push to net zero is not constrained by the lack of flexibility in our energy system.